The dust of the high plains had a taste. Rowan Cutter knew it better than any gospel. It tasted of alkali, old iron, and broken promises. It coated the back of his throat. A permanent grit that matched the weariness settled deep in his bones. He stood on the porch of the ranch house, a house built by the hands of his father, and watched the sun bleed out over the grasslands. The land was vast, a sea of drying grass that rolled toward the mountains in the far distance, looking more purple than blue in the dying light. This was the borderlands, somewhere in the great expanse between Montana and the Texas Panhandle. In the years after 1850, the railroad was coming. That was the rumor that spat from the lips of every speculator in the town of Dustmere. The railroad brought money, and it brought trouble. And Rowan already had enough of the second. He rolled his left shoulder. The old gunshot wound ached. A knot of scar tissue pulled tight beneath his shirt. A souvenir from the border wars that had taken his brother and left him the sole owner of this land. He was 28 years old and felt twice that. The ranch was silent. It was a cold silence, the kind that settles in a house where no fire burns in the kitchen hearth. The kitchen. He glanced through the open doorway. The big cast-iron stove was black and cold. A stack of pans sat by the dry sink, coated in soot and old grease. He had tried. He and the girl, June, had tried. But he was a man built for roping cattle and mending fences, not for baking bread. His meals were skillet bacon and beans, and he was tired of them. The cattle were tired too. They were thin, their ribs showing. The creek was low. The drought had come early this year, and the sky remained a hard, unforgiving blue. This land was parched, and the town of Dustmere, 5 miles east, was just as thirsty. It was a raw, new town, built of fresh pine and ambition. Men with hard eyes and soft hands argued over maps, claiming parcels of land they had never seen, all because the railroad might lay its iron veins nearby. And in the center of that web sat Silas Beckett, a man who dressed in eastern wools and spoke of progress, but whose eyes held the cold calculation of a wolf. Beckett wanted the valley, more than the land. He wanted the water. He wanted the creek that ran through the property of Rowan. Rowan looked toward the creek bed, now just a silver trickle in the mud. His family had held the rights to this water for 2 generations. But rights were flimsy things out here. The law was what a man could enforce with a rifle. Or, increasingly, what a man like Beckett could twist with a lawyer. Adding to the pressure, the rustlers led by Copper Jack had grown bold, hitting small herds, testing the boundaries. He needed help, not just with the cattle, but with the house, with June. June was his sister by choice, not by blood, the 10-year-old daughter of his dead ranch hand, left in his care. She was a good girl, quiet and tough, but she needed more than he could give her. She needed warmth. She needed food that did not come from a can. She needed a home, and this cold ranch house was not one. That was why he had agreed. The letter had come from a preacher back in Missouri. It was vague, speaking of a young woman of good character, displaced by tragedy, seeking safe harbor, a good worker. The preacher wrote, excellent in the kitchen. She was willing to travel, willing to work for keep and a small wage. He had sent back the money for the stagecoach ticket, feeling a fool even as he did it. He was hiring a woman, sight unseen, to live in his house. The advertisement he had placed had been for a cook. The letter he got back felt like an answer to a different, more desperate prayer. A sound broke the quiet, not the bawling of a calf, but the rattle of wheels and the jingle of a tired harness. The weekly stage was early. Rowan stiffened, his hand moving not to his pistol, but to the porch post, gripping it until his knuckles turned white. The stage did not usually stop here. It went straight to Dustmere. The coach, coated in a uniform layer of beige dust, pulled up near the empty corral. The driver, a man named Sykes, spat a stream of tobacco juice. "Mr. Cutter," he called out. Got a passenger for you." Rowan walked down the steps, his boots sinking into the dust. Sykes climbed down and opened the coach door. A young woman stepped out. She was small, younger than he had expected, perhaps 19 years old. She wore a plain gray dress, stained with the hardship of the journey. Her bonnet was pulled low, but he could see her face was pale and drawn. She carried a single worn carpet bag. She looked at him, her eyes wide, then dropped her gaze to the ground. "This here is Miss Eliza Hale," Sykes said, pulling her bag from the boot. "She come all the way from Missouri." Rowan nodded, touching the brim of his hat. "Ma'am, welcome to the Cutter Ranch. It is a hard journey." Eliza Hale said nothing. She only nodded, her hands clutching the handle of her bag. Sykes frowned. "She is a quiet one. This one did not speak a word the whole way from Dustmere." Rowan looked at the girl. Her silence was not shy. It was something else. It was deep and locked, like a heavy door. He remembered the preacher's letter. Displaced by tragedy. He had seen that look before, on men who had survived a fight when the man next to him had not. He took the bag from Sykes. It was light. "I will see to her," he told the driver. Sykes nodded, eager to get back on the road. "Good luck to you, Cutter. You will need it, with Beckett and his surveyors sniffing around your creek." Rowan's jaw tightened. He knew. He watched the stagecoach rattle away, leaving a plume of dust that hung in the still air. He was alone now, with this silent girl and the weight of the valley on his shoulders. He turned to her. "The house is this way." Eliza Hale followed him. She did not look at the vast, empty prairie. She did not look at the weak cattle. She kept her eyes on the porch steps, as if measuring the distance to safety. June was waiting in the doorway, a small, thin girl with her hair in two tight braids. She watched the new woman with a child's unfiltered curiosity. Eliza stopped when she saw June. Her shoulders, which had been tense, softened just a fraction. "This is June," Rowan said. "June, this is Miss Hale. She is here to help with the cooking." June offered a small, shy wave. Eliza met her gaze and, for the first time, her expression changed. A brief, small flicker of warmth crossed her features before the silence locked back into place. She gave June a slow, deliberate nod. Rowan pushed the door open wider. The house was dark. "The kitchen is through here," he said, his voice sounding overloud in the quiet. "It is not much. It needs a good hand." He led her into the heart of the cold house. The stove was a black monument to his failure. The surfaces were grimy. Eliza Hale put her bag down on the floor. She walked over to the stove and ran a finger along its cold top, leaving a clean streak in the soot. She looked at the empty wood box, then at the dry sink, then at the sacks of flour and cornmeal slumped in the corner, one of them chewed open by mice. Rowan felt a flush of shame. "I have been busy with the herd." Eliza looked at him. Her eyes were clear and direct. She nodded once, as if to say she understood. But it was not forgiveness. It was assessment. She turned, unbuttoned her dusty traveling coat, and hung it on a peg by the door. She rolled up the sleeves of her gray dress. She looked at Rowan, then pointed to the wood box, and then to the water buckets. He understood. She was not a bride. She was not a guest. She was a cook, and she was here to work. "I will get the wood," he said, turning, grateful for the task. "June, show Miss Hale where the pump is." From Eliza's perspective, the silence was a shield. She had built it stone by stone in the weeks after the attack on the wagon train, the weeks after she had watched her mother breathe her last on the banks of the Platte River, the sound of the gunfire, the shouting. It had all been too much. After it was over, she had found her voice gone, and when it tried to return, she had pushed it back down. Silence was safe. Men did not bother a silent woman. They thought her simple or broken or touched by God. They left her alone. She had her hands, and she had her mind. She could cook, a skill her mother had drilled into her. And she could write. Her script was clean and beautiful, a skill her father, a school teacher, had given her. The vague letter from the preacher had been her own idea, written with her own hand. It said just enough. She had chosen this place, this ad for a cook on a remote ranch, precisely because it was remote. She wanted to be away from men, away from towns, away from the dangers of the trail. This rancher, Rowan Cutter, was not what she expected. He was young, but his eyes were old. He was weary, but his frame was strong. And there was a scar on his shoulder, visible even through the fabric of his shirt. He was a man acquainted with violence, just as she was. But his violence was old, and hers was fresh. And there was the girl, June, a small, sad creature who looked as if she had forgotten how to smile. Eliza watched the girl lead her to the pump. June pointed. "The pump?" Eliza nodded. She worked the handle, her arms aching from the journey, until the water gushed out, clear and cold. She filled one bucket, then the other. The girl June watched her, her head tilted. "You do not talk?" June asked, her voice small. Eliza shook her head. She offered the girl a small, brief smile. Rowan returned with an armload of split pine and dumped it in the wood box. He watched Eliza lift the heavy bucket of water and pour it into the kettle. Her movements were economical, strong. She was not as fragile as she looked. She found the lye soap. She found the rags. She did not ask where they were. She simply looked, her eyes scanning the shelves, until she found what she needed. She began to scrub the black soot from the top of the stove. Rowan felt useless. He was the owner of the ranch, and he was standing idle in his own kitchen. "I have to check the north pasture," he said. "The cattle." Eliza paused her scrubbing. She looked at him and nodded. She understood work. "June, you stay here," Rowan ordered. "Help Miss Hale." June nodded, looking pleased. Rowan left them. He saddled his horse, his mind churning. What had he done? Brought a mute woman and a 10-year-old girl together in a house shadowed by drought and a land baron. He rode out, the rhythm of the horse a comfort. He scanned the horizon. The prairie was empty, but he felt he was being watched. He often felt that this land had many eyes. Some belonged to the Cheyenne or the Lakota, people who had been here for centuries, and some belonged to men like Copper Jack. He thought of his friend, Talon Greyhawk, a Lakota warrior who had once saved his life in a skirmish. Rowan had returned the favor, pulling him from a flooded river. They were bound by a debt of blood and respect. Talon moved between the worlds. He traded in Dustmere, but his heart was with the buffalo. He understood the new ways, the railroad, the white man's law, but he also understood the old ways, the whisper of the wind, the track of a broken twig. Rowan had not seen Talon in a month, but he knew he was near. There was a comfort in that, too. Talon understood this valley, and he understood the threat of men like Beckett. Back at the ranch, Eliza worked. She did not stop. She scrubbed the stove. She scoured the cast-iron pans until they shone with a dull gray light. Ready to be seasoned, she swept the floor. She found the mouse hole and had June find a rock to block it. June, delighted to have tasks, ran to obey. She brought the rock. She brought the broom. She pointed to the pantry. "Flour," June said. "Cornmeal, beans, not much else." Eliza nodded. She inspected the flour sack. It would do. She found potatoes and onions in a small root cellar under the floorboards. She found a side of salt pork hanging from a hook. It was enough. She rebuilt the fire. She was not just a cook. She was a creator. She understood the alchemy of heat and ingredients. Soon, the cold kitchen began to change. The smell of pine smoke filled the air, chasing out the smell of dust and disuse. The kettle on the stove began to hiss, steam puffing from its spout. Warmth began to creep into the corners of the room. June sat at the rough wooden table, watching. Eliza washed her hands, dried them on her apron, and began to work the flour, water, and salt. Her hands were deft. She was making biscuits. When Rowan returned hours later, the sun was gone and a chill wind had picked up. He was cold and tired, and the cattle in the north pasture were weaker than he feared. He walked toward the house, his shoulders slumped. Then he stopped. A light was glowing in the kitchen window, a warm, yellow light, and a smell was coming from the chimney. Not just smoke. It was the smell of baking bread, the smell of roasted onions. He opened the door. The kitchen was transformed. It was warm. The stove was radiating heat. A lantern sat on the table, its light full and steady. June was sitting at the table, her face bright, setting out 3 tin plates. Eliza stood by the stove. A pot was bubbling, sending up a rich steam. A pan of biscuits was cooling on the counter. The room was clean. The soot was gone. Rowan stood in the doorway, the cold wind at his back, the warmth of the kitchen on his face. Eliza looked at him. She ladled a thick stew into a bowl and placed it on the table. She pointed to the chair at the head of the table. He took off his hat. He sat down. June scrambled into her seat. Eliza served June, then herself. They sat in silence. Rowan picked up his spoon. He was almost afraid to taste it. He was afraid the hope was false. He took a bite. It was potato and onion and salt pork. But it was more than that. It was hot. It was rich. It was real food. He picked up a biscuit. It was light and flaky and melted in his mouth. He looked across the table at the silent woman. Her eyes were on her plate. She ate with a quiet dignity. June ate, her spoon scraping the bottom of the bowl. She looked at Rowan, then at Eliza. A slow smile spread across her face. A real smile. One Rowan had not seen in months. "It is good," June said. "It is so good." Eliza did not look up, but a faint touch of color rose in her cheeks. Rowan ate, the warmth spreading from his stomach to his limbs. The ache in his shoulders seemed to ease. The dust in his throat felt, for a moment, settled. This silent woman was a mystery. He did not know her story. He did not know what horrors had stolen her voice. He only knew that for the first time in a very long time. The fire was lit, the kitchen was clean, and his house, this cold, empty ranch house, felt a little less like a shelter and a little more like a home. He had a cook. He had a partner in this, even if she never spoke a word. Now, perhaps, he could begin to fight for the water. The next morning, Rowan woke before dawn, a habit ingrained by years of ranch work. He pulled on his boots in the dark, the leather cold against his skin. Usually, the house would be silent and cold, but as he stepped into the main room, he felt a difference. A low, steady warmth was already pushing back the chill. He walked toward the kitchen. Eliza Hale was already there, her back to him, stoking the fire in the stove. The wood box, which he had left half full, was now brimming with fresh pine and juniper. She must have risen in the dark to fetch it herself. A large kettle was already heating. The kitchen, which had been his shame, was now a place of order. The scoured pans were hanging from hooks. The sacks of flour and cornmeal were stacked neatly, the torn one patched with a piece of clean cloth. She heard his boot step and turned. She was wearing a different dress, a simple blue calico, and a clean white apron. She looked less like a refugee and more like a woman who belonged in a kitchen. She nodded a greeting to him, then turned back to the stove, lifting a heavy skillet onto the heat. The smell of coffee soon joined the wood smoke. It was a luxury, one he rarely bothered with for himself, but she had found the small tin of beans he kept on the high shelf. She ground them in the small hand mill, the rhythmic crunching sound a punctuation to the morning's quiet. June came stumbling out of her small room, rubbing her eyes. She stopped, her gaze fixed on Eliza. "Miss Hale," June whispered. "You are already up." Eliza looked at the girl, and her expression, usually so guarded, softened. She motioned to the table, where a bowl and spoon were already set for her. The incident happened an hour later. Eliza was rendering salt pork in the skillet, the hot grease popping. June, trying to be helpful, had moved a small sack of cornmeal too close to the edge of the stove to make room for the plates. A log shifted in the firebox, sending a bright spark out of a gap in the stove's iron plate. It landed on a stray trickle of meal on the floor, which flared up instantly, the flame leaping up the side of the nearby flour sack. "Fire!" June screamed. Rowan, who had been oiling a harness at the table, jumped up, his chair crashing backward. His first instinct was to grab the water bucket, a disastrous choice that would have spread the grease fire. Eliza Hale moved with a speed that defied her calm exterior. She did not shout. She did not panic. She spun, grabbed the heavy wool blanket they kept by the door for winter drafts, and in one fluid motion, she smothered the burning sack. She beat at the flames with the heavy wool, her movements precise and angry, until there was nothing left but a cloud of acrid smoke and the smell of scorched flour. She stood breathing hard, the blanket in her hands. June was crying, huddled by the door. Rowan was frozen, staring at the blackened spot on the sack. She had saved it. She had saved his supplies, a grease fire and a flour fire at once, and she had known exactly what to do. He let out a long breath. "That was quick thinking. Ma'am, you saved my pantry." Eliza only nodded, her chest still heaving. She pushed a stray strand of hair back from her face, her hand trembling slightly. As she tucked the hair behind her ear, her sleeve, damp from the water pump, pulled back. Rowan saw it clearly in the morning light. On the pale skin of her inner wrist, there was a dark, distinct smudge. It was not dirt. It was not a bruise. It was the unmistakable stain of dried ink. He looked from the stain to her face. She saw where his gaze had settled. Quickly, she pulled her sleeve down, her expression shuddering, the familiar mask of silence locking back into place. He filed the image away. This silent cook, who could move like a fighter and put out a fire like a veteran, could also write. It was a rare skill, especially for a woman on the frontier. It added another layer to the mystery she carried. What was she hiding behind that silence? He wanted to ask, but the set of her jaw told him it was useless. Instead, he said, "I am riding out to check the creek. June, stay and help Miss Hale. Stay away from the stove." He rode out, the morning's alarm still thrumming in his veins. The drought had worsened. The sky was a pale, empty bowl. The creek, when he reached it, was barely a man's width across, trickling over the stones, and there, standing ankle-deep in the precious water, were two men. They were pounding a tall wooden stake into the creek bed, a second stake already standing on the bank. They had a tripod and a looking glass, surveying equipment. Rowan spurred his horse. "What in blazes do you think you are doing?" he shouted. "This is my water." The men did not look surprised to see him. One, a short, stocky man with a stained vest, pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. "We are surveying for the railroad." "Cutter," he said, his voice smug. "Under the authority of Silas Beckett and the new Territorial Development Act." Rowan snatched the paper. It was full of legal words, dense and confusing, but the signature at the bottom was Silas Beckett's. "This is my property," Rowan said, his voice low and dangerous. "This is a public waterway," the man countered, "and we are just measuring the flow, for the good of progress." They had placed their measuring station right at the head of the ditch that irrigated his hayfields. "Get your equipment and your stakes off my land," Rowan said, his hand moving toward the pistol on his hip. The surveyor just smiled. "You draw on us, Cutter, and you will be in front of a federal judge before sundown. We are agents of the railroad. You will lose this ranch and the water." Rowan's hand froze. He was caught. He knew the man was right. This was not a fight to be won with a gun. It was a fight to be waged with paper, and he had just seen proof that his silent cook knew how to use it. He crumpled the paper in his fist. He watched them finish their work, his heart a cold knot of fury. They were measuring his water, the lifeblood of his land, preparing to steal it. He returned to the ranch hours later, defeated and angry. The smell of baking cornbread met him at the door. He walked into the kitchen. June was sitting at the table, a piece of charcoal in her hand, drawing on a piece of slate. Eliza was sliding a golden slab of cornbread from a pan. June looked up, her face bright. "Eliza is teaching me letters," she said. Rowan looked at Eliza. She froze, the pan in her hand, her eyes wide with something like fear. She had been caught. Rowan's anger faded, replaced by a complex surge of confusion. He looked at the slate. June had drawn a clumsy B. He looked at Eliza's ink-stained wrist. He did not challenge her. He was too tired, and the problem with Beckett was too large. He just nodded, pulling out his chair. That night, the stew was thick, and the cornbread was the best he had ever tasted. It was sweet, with a crisp crust. June took a bite, her cheeks full, and she let out a sound Rowan had not heard in almost a year, a real, bubbling laugh. "It is better than the fare," she declared. Rowan looked at Eliza. She was watching June, and the smallest, most fleeting smile touched her lips. His heart ached. He looked at this strange, silent woman who had brought laughter back to his table. Even as the world was closing in, he would not send her away. He could not. He needed her. June needed her. Later that evening, June brought one of his work shirts to Eliza. It was torn at the elbow. "Can you fix it?" June asked. Eliza took the shirt. She sat in the rocking chair by the hearth, the firelight catching the auburn highlights in her hair. She pulled a small sewing kit from her carpet bag. Her needle moved with a quick, sure rhythm, the stitches small and even. Rowan watched her from the shadows. The simple, domestic act felt profound. She was mending his shirt. She was mending his house. He felt a wave of gratitude that was potent and unsettling. He cleared his throat. "Thank you, ma'am." Eliza did not look up, but she paused her sewing for a moment. She gave a single, short nod. The distance between them remained, a canyon of silence. But for the first time, he felt he had thrown a single, thin rope across it. That night, he lay awake, his mind on the surveyors. The drought was killing him, and Beckett was moving in for the final blow. The ranch's main water cistern was low, the wooden staves shrinking in the dry air. If it failed, he would have no water reserves at all. The herd would be finished. As he was drifting into an uneasy sleep, he heard it, the faint, unmistakable sound of shod horses, moving where no horses should be. He got up, pulling his rifle from the wall, and went to the window. The moonlight washed the prairie in pale silver. He saw nothing. No riders, no cattle, just the wind moving through the dry grass. But he knew what he had heard. In the morning, he found it, on the main gate post, a single, perfect eagle feather tied with a strip of dark, cured leather. Talon. His friend had been here. He had seen the strange riders. This was his warning. Danger was no longer on the horizon. It was at his gate. Rowan rode into Dustmere later that day, the feather tucked in his pocket. He needed supplies, but more. He needed to gauge the mood in town. The saloon was the only place to do that. It was loud, full of ranchers, speculators, and railroad men. And in the center of it, holding a glass of whiskey, stood Silas Beckett. He was a thick man, his wool suit out of place, but his voice commanded the room. "The future is coming. Gentlemen," he proclaimed, his voice booming. "It runs on iron rails, and those rails run on water. Some say this valley is drying up. I say, it just needs proper management." A nervous silence fell over the room. Beckett smiled, a cold, thin expression. "Mark my words, He who holds the water in this valley holds the future." The men looked at each other, then at Rowan, who stood by the door. Everyone knew who Beckett was talking about. Rowan's ranch had the last reliable spring in the region. Rowan turned and left without a word. The threat was public now. The fight was here. He rode home, the weight of the future, of the water, and of Beckett's words heavy on him. He also thought of Eliza. He had a silent cook who could read, a young girl who was finally laughing, and a water supply that was about to become a battlefield. And somewhere in the hills, he had an ally. Talon's warning feather was a sliver of ice in Rowan's pocket. The threat was no longer a distant rumble. It was at his gate. 2 nights later, it stepped over the threshold. It was the deep hour of the night, when the moon was down and the world was held in blackness. Rowan woke not to a sound, but to a feeling, a wrongness in the air. Then it came the nervous bawling of cattle, a sound of panic, not of complaint. It was followed by a single, sharp crack of a rifle. The shot was not aimed at the house. It was a statement. He was out of bed, pulling on his trousers and boots, his rifle in his hand before the echo had faded. He ran to the corral, the dry, cold earth biting at his bare feet until his boots were on. His horse whinnied. Sensing the trouble, he rode bareback, his rifle across his thighs, toward the north pasture. The herd was scattered, a dark, churning mass moving west toward the broken hills. It was a classic rustler's tactic: push them hard, split them up, and pick off the stragglers. He rode hard for an hour, pushing the cattle back, his voice raw from shouting, his hands sore from gripping the horse's mane. By the first gray light of dawn, he saw the true picture. The main herd was safe, but exhausted. Near a washout, a young calf lay on its side, a dark gash on its flank, either from a fall in the dark or a deliberate strike. He dismounted, his legs shaking with adrenaline, and he saw the mark. On the hides of 3 of his best steers, not a brand, but a smear of fresh, bright paint, a crude circle, like a snake biting its own tail, the sign of Copperjack. This was not a raid for profit. It was a message, just as the surveyors had been. It was Beckett, using Copperjack as his dog, letting him off the leash to nip at his heels. As Rowan knelt by the wounded calf, his fury a cold stone in his gut, a shape detached itself from the rocks above. Talon Greyhawk appeared as if from the earth itself, his moccasins making no sound. He carried his bow, his eyes already reading the story in the dirt. He looked at the painted steers, then at the scattered tracks. "They wanted you to run," Talon said, his voice quiet, blending with the morning wind. "They wanted you angry to make a mistake." Rowan, exhausted, saw only a chaos of hoof prints. Talon pointed. "This one." He indicated a single set of tracks, pressed deeper than the others. A heavy rider. The right foreshoe of the horse had a distinct chip missing from the outer edge. "I will remember this," Talon said. He looked toward the ranch house, now visible in the growing light. "This is not the end. This is the beginning." They carried the wounded calf back to the barn. Its mother followed, bawling low. Rowan felt the weight of the fight settle on him. It was not just paper and ink. It was paint and gunpowder. The next day, the other face of the threat arrived. It came not on horseback, but in a polished black buggy that looked absurd against the dusty plains. Rowan was on the porch, trying to replace a rotted plank, his hands stinging with splinters. He watched the buggy approach, his scar on his left shoulder beginning to throb. The wind was rising, shifting to the north, promising a change in the weather. And his old wound always spoke up first. A man stepped out. He was not Silas Beckett. He was thin, dressed in a black wool suit despite the heat, and carried a leather satchel. He introduced himself as Mr. Finch, legal counsel for the Western Development and Railroad Company. He was polite, his voice smooth, his teeth small and white. He sat in Rowan's kitchen, a place that now smelled perpetually of baking bread and roasted coffee. Eliza was there, washing potatoes at the dry sink, her back to the room, a wall of silent industry. "Mr. Cutter," Finch began, taking a sheaf of papers from his satchel. "Silas Beckett is a man of progress. He understands your position, your attachment to this land. He wants to be a good neighbor." Rowan said nothing. He just watched the man's hands. Finch laid the papers on the table. "This is a simple agreement of access," he explained. "It merely allows our surveyors to continue their vital work, to measure the waterway for the good of the territory. In return, the company will formally recognize your prior claim, shielding you from any future disputes." He pushed the papers toward Rowan. "It is," he added with a thin smile, "for your own protection." Rowan picked up the contract. He was not an ignorant man, but this was a different language. He read the words, "Heretofore, whereas riparian rights, cessation." It was a thicket of ink designed to trap him. He felt a hot flush of shame, the old anger at being made to feel stupid. His scar ached. He felt the pressure building. If he signed, maybe Copperjack would back off. Maybe the surveyors would be legal and predictable. If he refused, he knew what came next. A lawsuit, a fight he could not afford. "I will read it," Rowan said, his voice rough. "I do not sign things on the wind." Finch's smile did not falter. "Of course. A prudent man takes his time. I will return tomorrow, at the same hour, for the finalized document." He stood, tipped his hat to Eliza's unmoving back, and left. The contract remained on the table, a paper snake in the heart of the house. That night, the tension was a physical thing. Rowan paced the porch, the dry wind howling, promising dust, not rain. He could not sleep. The wounded calf was weak, refusing to drink. He felt despair creeping in. He woke near midnight to a creaking floorboard. He saw Eliza's silhouette against the pale square of the window. She was pulling her shawl on, her movements quick and quiet. She slipped out the back door. His first thought was suspicion. Was she leaving meeting someone? He grabbed his pistol, his heart pounding, and followed her at a distance. She did not go toward the road. She went to the pump. He watched from the shadows as she worked the handle, the rhythmic squeak cutting through the wind. She filled a bucket, her small frame straining, and carried it not to the house, but to the barn. He crept closer, peering through a gap in the weathered planks. There, in the lantern light, was the wounded calf. It was lying on a bed of fresh hay he had not put there. Eliza was kneeling beside it, dipping a clean rag in the bucket and patiently squeezing water into the calf's mouth. She murmured to it, a low, soothing sound. Not words, just a soft hum. She was stubbornly, silently, fighting for the weakest thing on his ranch. He retreated to the house, his shame and gratitude a confusing knot in his chest. The next morning, June ran to him, her face alight, pulling him by the hand to the barn. She pointed to the stall, on the small slate they used for her letters. June had written in large, clumsy charcoal letters, "Miss Eliza saved Milky." Rowan looked at the calf. It was standing, wobbly, but standing. He looked at the sign. His throat felt tight. Talon returned later that day. He had followed the track of the chipped hoofshoe for miles, until it disappeared in the rocky high country, the rider clearly knowing how to hide his trail. He came to the kitchen, tired and grim. Eliza, seeing the exhaustion on both men, had been busy. She had found a forgotten crock of dried apples in the root cellar. When the men sat down, she placed a pie on the table. The crust was golden, and the smell of cinnamon and baked apples filled the kitchen. It was a smell of civilization, of a life Rowan had almost forgotten. They ate in silence. Talon finished his piece, then took another. He looked at Eliza, who was cleaning a pot, then at the big black stove. "My grandfather," Talon said, his voice thoughtful, "told me that a lodge is just poles and skin. It is the fire in the center, The bepo. That is the heart. A house without a warm hearth is a dead body. Eliza stopped her scrubbing. She stood very still, her back to him, but he knew she was listening. He had anchored the theme of the house. The hearth was the heart, and she, the silent cook, was its keeper. Rowan, agitated, could not sit still. He left the contract on the table and went back outside to fight the wind, to try and mend the cistern. Talon rode out again to watch the high ridges. Eliza was left alone in the kitchen with June. She dried her hands. She looked at the papers on the table. She looked out the window. Rowan was a distant figure, hammering. She picked up the contract. Her eyes, sharp and practiced, scanned the first page. It was exactly as Finch had described. She turned to the second page. More of the same. Then, buried in a dense paragraph on the third page, she found it. The trap. The company was granted the right to make improvements to the waterway for the sake of efficiency. The costs of said improvements, to be determined at the company's sole discretion, would be placed as a senior lien against the described property. It was not a shield. It was a spear. It was a mortgage in disguise. They would build a dam, charge him an impossible sum, and when he could not pay, they would take the ranch. Legally. She put the paper down, her heart beating fast. Rowan returned at dusk, defeated. The wind had won. The cistern was still leaking. He rode to Dustmere for more supplies, his mood as dark as the gathering clouds. At the general store, he found more bad news. The proprietor, a nervous man named Harris, was wringing his hands. He told Rowan the rumor. The county clerk, a man known to play cards with Silas Beckett, had been telling anyone who would listen that Rowan Cutter's original land patent was misplaced, lost in the files. Without that patent, his claim to the land was just air. The trap was closing. He had no legal proof of ownership. And Beckett was offering him a contract that would make him a tenant on his own land. He rode home, the dust stinging his eyes. He felt the old scar pull tight. He was afraid. He was afraid of losing this valley, his father's legacy, the only home June had. He walked into the kitchen. June was asleep in her room. Eliza was sitting in the rocker by the fire, darning his socks. The light from the hearth played on her face. He slumped at the desk, staring at the contract. Signing it felt like swallowing poison, but refusing it felt like jumping off a cliff. He could not breathe. He stood and walked onto the porch, gripping the post, leaning into the howling wind. He was beaten. When he came back inside, the room was dark except for the low glow of the fire. He walked to the desk, ready to sign, ready to save what little he could. The contract was there, but on top of it was June's small slate. He picked it up. In the flickering firelight, he saw the writing. It was not June's clumsy letters. It was a clean, perfect script, sharp and confident. 3 words. Do not sign. He stared at the words, his blood running cold, then hot. He looked at Eliza. She was still in the rocker, her head bent over her sewing, as if she were the most casual observer in the world. But he saw her hand, the one holding the needle, tremble, just once. She had read it. She understood. And she had, in her own way, shouted. He stood taller, the ache in his shoulder, the fear in his gut. It all seemed to recede, replaced by a cold, hard clarity. The wind was still howling, but the fire in his kitchen was warm, and he was not alone. When Mr. Finch arrived in his buggy the next morning, Rowan was waiting on the porch. He walked down the steps, the unsigned contract in his hand. He held it out to the lawyer. I will not be signing. Finch's polite mask tightened. This is a mistake, Mr. Cutter, a grave mistake. Rowan just looked at him. Get off my land. He watched the buggy turn and retreat in a cloud of dust. He had accepted the war. The morning after the lawyer's departure, the kitchen was silent. The small slate with its 3 defiant words, do not sign, sat on the table. It was not an accusation. It was a flag. It marked the spot where the stand would be made. Rowan, Talon, and Eliza stood around the rough wooden table. It was a council of war, held in the heart of the house, by the warmth of the stove. "They will not use paper next," Rowan said, his voice low. He rubbed the old scar on his shoulder. "They will use copperjack, and they will use the law in Dustmere, the lost patent. They are trying to erase me from the land." Talon Greyhawk watched Eliza pour coffee. His eyes were sharp. "She knows the way of paper," he said. Rowan nodded. He looked at Eliza. "I need to ride the south fence line. Check for breaks." "He is right. You understand the clerk, the books. I need to know what is in that courthouse." Eliza met his gaze. She was afraid. He could see it in the tightness of her mouth. Dustmere was full of men who stared, men like the ones who had followed her from the general store. But she picked up the slate. She wiped it clean. She wrote, her hand steady, "I will get supplies. I will look at the map book." Talon nodded. "It is a good plan. While you hold the paper and Rowan holds the wire, I will hunt. I will find the camp of Copperjack. I will find the horse with the chipped shoe." Rowan went to the small lockbox where he kept his money. He took out several coins and placed them on the table in front of Eliza. "Be careful," he said. "More careful than me." He rode out, his rifle in its scabbard, a hammer and a bag of fence staples tied to his saddle. He felt the change. He was not just a rancher trying to survive. He was a man in a fight, with allies. One who hunted in the hills, and one who kept the hearth. Rowan made it to Dustmere by noon. He needed galvanized wire, and he needed to see the faces of the men he was fighting. He tied his horse outside the general store and walked, not to the store, but to the saloon. He needed to know the temper of the town. The air inside was thick with smoke and the smell of stale whiskey. He ordered a beer and stood at the end of the bar, watching. It did not take long. A big man, his face rough with stubble and sunburn, detached himself from a back table. He wore a long coat, and on its front, glinting in the dim light, were several dull copper buttons. It was Copperjack. "Well, look who it is," the man boomed, his voice scraping like a boot on gravel. "The king of the dry creek." Rowan turned slowly. He did not touch his pistol. He just looked at the man. "I heard you told Mr. Beckett's lawyer to go back to the city," Copperjack sneered. Stepping closer, "Maybe you think you are too good for his money. Maybe you need a lesson in respect." He shoved Rowan hard, spilling his beer. The saloon went quiet. Every eye was on them. Rowan felt the familiar, hot rush of adrenaline. The scar on his shoulder throbbed, a drumbeat of old violence. He wanted to draw. He wanted to put this man down. This man who painted his cattle and haunted his nights. But he saw the faces of the other men. They were witnesses. He thought of the contract. He thought of the slate. Do not sign. This was a legal fight. If he drew his gun, he was a killer. If he fought, he was just a man defending himself. Copperjack laughed and shoved him again. "You a coward." "Cutter." Rowan set his mug down. He did not draw. He hit Copperjack with his right fist, a blow fueled by months of fear and frustration. It caught the bigger man on the jaw, snapping his head back. Copperjack roared and lunged. It was not a fight, it was a brawl. They crashed over a table. Rowan took a punch to the ribs that stole his breath. He saw the man's hand move, not for a gun, but for the knife at his belt. Rowan did not give him the chance. He put his boot on the man's chest and kicked, shoving him backward. Copperjack stumbled, hit the batwing doors, and crashed into the dusty street. Rowan stood, breathing hard. His lip was split, and he tasted blood. He looked at the stunned crowd. "I am not breaking the law," he said, his voice ragged. "But this is my land." He walked out of the saloon, leaving Copperjack cursing in the dust. He had kept the legal high ground. He had won the first skirmish. Eliza arrived in town an hour after Rowan, on the supply wagon, She went to the general store, her list in her hand. She felt the eyes of the town on her. The silent woman, the new cook at the Cutter place. She bought her flour, her salt, her baking soda. She kept her head down. As she was leaving, a man stepped in front of her. He was not one of the store's usual patrons. He was thin, with shifty eyes and a coat that was too big for him. "You are the new woman at the ranch," he said, his voice too friendly. A quiet thing. "Are you not?" Eliza tried to step around him. He blocked her path. "Maybe you would like a drink. A pretty thing like you should not be so quiet." He reached out to touch her arm. The terror was immediate, cold and sharp. She saw the dusty flatlands. She heard the crack of rifles, the screams. She felt the old panic rise, threatening to choke her. But the kitchen, the fire, the sight of June's smile. It had forged something new in her. She was not the same girl who had hidden in the wagon. She did not scream. She did not run. She acted. She had a small bag of salt in her hand. With a single, vicious motion, she ripped the cloth bag open and threw the entire contents into the man's face. He howled, a high, thin sound, his hands flying to his eyes. He stumbled back, blind and sputtering. Eliza did not hesitate. She swung the heavier bag of flour with all her strength, hitting him square in the stomach. The wind left him in a dusty whoosh. He doubled over, gasping. She walked past him, her heart hammering against her ribs, and did not look back. She loaded her supplies onto the wagon and started the team of horses toward home. From the shaded alley across the street, Talon Greyhawk watched. He had seen the man following her. His knife was already in his hand. His body tensed to move. He had been ready to intervene. He watched Eliza blind the man with salt and fold him with flour. He saw her walk away, her back straight. A small, rare smile touched his lips. He slipped his knife back into its sheath. The silent cook did not need his help today. He melted back into the shadows to continue his own hunt. When Rowan returned, his lips swollen, he found Eliza in the kitchen, kneading dough. She looked pale, but she was unharmed. They looked at each other. Two soldiers returned from different fronts. Neither spoke of what had happened. There was no need. Later that afternoon, Rowan was outside, fixing the corral gate, his muscles aching. He heard a sound from the house. It was the voice of June, hesitant and small, sounding out words. He moved to the window. June was sitting on the floor, a small, worn primer book in her lap. It was Eliza's. Eliza sat beside her, her finger pointing to the page. June said, her brow furrowed. "The cat?" "Cat," Eliza whispered. The sound was so quiet, it was barely more than breath. "The cat runs," June finished, her face exploding in a triumphant smile. "I read it. Miss Eliza, I read the words." Eliza smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. She put her arm around June's shoulders and hugged her. Rowan stood in the shadows, his bruised hands resting on the window frame. He looked at the woman and the child. He saw the light in the small room, the warmth. He saw what Silas Beckett was trying to take. It was not just water. It was not just land. It was this. It was the home that this silent woman was building, word by word, and loaf by loaf. Eliza had to go back. The next day, she took the wagon again. This time, her destination was the courthouse. She walked into the clerk's office, her hands cold. The clerk, Mr. Tibbs, was a small man with a nervous twitch. She placed the slate on his counter. "Cutter, Rowan, land patent." Mr. Tibbs fiddled with his inkwell. "I am terribly sorry. Miss, those files are, misplaced. The archives are in a dreadful state." Eliza had expected this. She pointed to the large, leather-bound atlas on the wall shelf behind him. Township maps. He could not refuse a public request. With an annoyed sigh, he heaved the heavy book onto the counter. Eliza opened it. Her fingers, stained with ink from her own small bottle, traced the lines of the valley. She knew the map from Rowan's desk, the old, worn one his father had drawn. She found their parcel, Section 12, and she saw the lie. The creek, the lifeblood of the ranch, was drawn wrong. The line veered sharply east, placing the main spring, the headwaters, outside of the Cutter property line. It made the spring appear to be on the adjoining parcel, the one Silas Beckett had claimed last month. The ink on that line was darker than the rest. It was new. It was a forgery. She took out her own small notebook and a pencil, with deft, quick strokes. She began to copy the map, her hand moving with the skill of a trained clerk. Mr. Tibbs protested. "Now, miss, there is no call for that. That is official county property." Eliza did not look up. She finished her drawing. She had the proof. The map was the weapon. The sky had been a sickly yellow for 2 days. The wind had not stopped, a high, mournful howl that scraped the nerves raw. Then, in the middle of the afternoon, the world ended. A wall of black dust, a mile high, rolled in from the north. The sun vanished. The temperature dropped. It was noon, but it was as dark as midnight. The cattle panicked. They turned their backs to the wind and ran, blind and bawling, into the blackness. Rowan was fighting to get the horses into the barn. The air was so thick he could not see his own hands. "June, Eliza," he roared. "Get in the cellar. Bolt the door." He got on his horse, tying his bandana over his face, and rode into the storm. It was hopeless. The herd was moving, a stampede of terror. They would run off a cliff, or scatter so far he would never find them. Then he saw a light. It was a lantern, bobbing in the blackness. It was Eliza. She was on foot, holding June's hand. She was not running to the house. She was walking toward the panicked herd. In her other hand, she held an iron pot and a metal spoon, banging them together. A sharp, rhythmic clang that cut through the roar of the wind. "Get back," he screamed. "You will be killed." She did not seem to hear him. She just kept walking, steady, banging the pot. The lead steers, blind and desperate for direction, heard the sound. They saw the faint, steady light. They began to turn. She was moving toward the Box Canyon, a natural shelter of high rock walls just north of the house. She was leading them. Rowan stared, his mind unable to grasp her courage. He spurred his horse, riding to the flank, helping her, yelling until his throat was raw. Together, in the heart of the black storm, they pushed the entire herd into the safety of the canyon. That night, the house was sealed against the wind. Fine, bitter dust covered everything. Eliza was asleep in the rocking chair by the hearth, too exhausted to move to her bed. She began to dream. She twisted, the blankets falling to the floor. "No!" she whimpered. "Mother, please stop!" Rowan and Talon, who had found his way to the house in the storm, watched, frozen. The man she cried out, her voice choked with sleep and terror. The copper button. Talon's head snapped up. He moved closer, kneeling. "Eliza," he said, his voice quiet but firm. She woke with a gasp, her eyes wide, her hand flying to her mouth. She saw them watching. The shame was instant. She had made a sound. She had broken her vow. Talon did not look away. "The men who attacked your wagon train," he said, "the leader. He wore a coat with copper buttons." Eliza stared at him. The dust, the wind, the memory. It was all too much. She could only nod, her body shaking violently. Talon looked at Rowan. His face was a mask of cold fury. "Copperjack." The pieces clicked into place. The rustler was not just a hired hand. He was the monster from her past. Eliza was pale for days. She retreated back into her silence, deeper than before, but she did not stop working. She baked, she cleaned, she mended, and she began a new ritual. Rowan was in his small room, trying to make sense of the map Eliza had copied. He was bruised from the fight, tired from the storm. He heard a faint sound outside his door. He opened it. A bowl of hot broth sat on the small table in the hall. Steam rose from it, smelling of onion and thyme. He looked up. Eliza was walking back to the kitchen, her back to him. It happened the next night, and the next. A silent offering. It was not just food, it was fuel. It was a promise. The hearth was still lit. Talon had been gone since the storm. He returned on the 4th day, his horse caked in dried mud. He walked into the kitchen, where Rowan was drinking coffee. "The map is a lie," Talon said, "but it is just paper. I found a man." Rowan looked up. Old man Hemlock. "He traps in the high country." "He was here before your father." "He told me he helped your father set the first boundary stones for this ranch. He marked it by the 3 tall pines and the eagle's nest." Talon leaned forward. He knows the true line of the creek, and he will testify. He remembers. Talon's discovery of a living witness, Old Man Hemlock, was a single ray of light in the encroaching darkness. But Silas Beckett was a man who moved faster than a trapper could walk. The very next day, a rider from Dustmere, a deputy Rowan did not trust, delivered the papers. It was no longer a threat. It was a war. The county court, swayed by Silas Beckett's influence and the lost patent, had officially filed an injunction. Rowan Cutter was ordered to cease and desist drawing water from the disputed spring. A preliminary hearing was set. In 30 days. 30 days. Rowan stared at the document. In 30 days, without water, his herd would be gone. His ranch would be a graveyard. Beckett was not just suing him. He was strangling him. The news settled over the ranch like the dust from the storm, but it was not a blanket of despair. It was a whetstone. The fear was still there, but now it was sharp. "We have a witness," Rowan said that night, the legal paper flat on the kitchen table. "And we have the forged map." "But they have the law," Talon said, his face grim in the lamplight. "And they have Copper Jack. They will not wait 30 days. He looked at Rowan, then at Eliza. "You are a rancher. Rowan, you know how to fight with a rope and a rifle, but you must be ready to fight with signals, with silence." He turned to Eliza. "And you, little sister, you have a fire inside you. You used it in the storm. You must learn to aim it." And so, the training began. In the cool hours after dawn, before the heat became unbearable, Talon took them to the box canyon. He taught Rowan not how to fight, but how to see. He showed him how to read the bend of a blade of grass, how a stone, overturned, shows its damp, dark belly to the sky, a sign of a recent passerby. He taught him the whistle of the hawk, and how to tell it from a man's imitation. For Eliza, the lesson was different. Talon brought out Rowan's spare rifle. It was heavy, the barrel long, the wooden stock scarred. Eliza flinched. The sight of it, the smell of the gun oil, brought back the metallic taste of terror. She shook her head, her hands flying up to ward it off. "This is not for killing," Talon said, his voice gentle but firm. "This is not for revenge. That is Copper Jack's way. This is for talking." He showed her how to load it, how to hold it, the butt firm against her shoulder. She was shaking, her eyes squeezed shut. "Open your eyes," he commanded. "Look at what you fear." She opened them. She saw the scarred wood, the dark steel. "This is a tool," Talon continued. "Like your stove, like your pen. It can be used for warmth, or it can be used to burn. You will use it to be heard." He had her aim at the canyon wall, far from any living thing. "Your first shot is to make them look. Your second shot is to tell them where you are. Your third shot tells them you are not alone." He taught her a simple signal. 1 shot, pause. 2 shots. "Help. I am here." She fired. The sound was a violent crack that echoed off the rocks. She stumbled back, dropping the rifle. The sound, the kick, the smoke. It was too much. She sank to the ground, her face in her hands. Rowan started toward her, but Talon put out a hand, stopping him. She sat there for a long time. Rowan watched, his heart aching for her. He saw the struggle in the set of her shoulders. Finally, she stood up. Her face was pale, her lips a thin white line. She picked up the rifle. She loaded it herself. She raised it, her arms trembling, and fired again and again. She did not stop until the magazine was empty. She did not hit the rock she was aiming for, but she had not dropped the gun. She had stood her ground. That night, the house was quiet. June was asleep. Talon was out, a ghost in the hills, checking the ridges. Rowan sat at the table, his head in his hands, staring at the injunction. The 30-day deadline felt like a noose. He looked up as Eliza placed his nightly bowl of broth on the desk. She turned to leave. "Wait," he said, his voice rough. She stopped, her back to him. He had never spoken of his fear, not to anyone, but looking at her, this small, silent woman who had faced down a rifle that morning. He felt the words break free. "My father built this house. He broke this land. My brother, he died for it. In the border skirmishes, he took a bullet that was meant for me." He touched the scar on his shoulder. It was a lie. The bullet had not been meant for him. It had just been a bullet. But he felt the guilt all the same. "If I lose this ranch," he whispered, staring at the legal papers, "if I let Beckett take this water, it is not just land. It is all I have left. It is like losing them all over again." He had not realized how close she was. She had turned. She was standing beside his chair. He looked up at her, his eyes raw with a fear he had never admitted. Eliza looked at him, her gaze direct and unwavering. She saw the proud, weary rancher stripped bare. He was just a man, afraid of ghosts, afraid of loss. She picked up June's slate. Her hand was steady. She wrote, the charcoal scratching in the quiet. She held it up for him to read. "Home is not the land. Home is the people by the hearth." He read the words once, then twice. A profound stillness settled over him. He looked from the slate to her face. He saw the strength that had held her silent for so long. He saw the fire Talon had spoken of. He reached out, his calloused, bruised hand, and his fingers brushed the back of her hand, the one holding the slate. It was a touch as light as a spark. "Thank you," he said. She nodded. She took the slate and went back to the kitchen, leaving him alone with the warmth. The irrigation ditch for the lower pasture had been damaged in the stampede. It was their last hope for keeping the hayfield alive. They had to fix it. And it was too dangerous to work in the daylight, a perfect target for a rifle on the ridge. They went out at night, all three of them. Rowan dug, his shovel biting into the hard, dry earth. Talon moved rocks, rebuilding the collapsed bank. Eliza carried buckets of mud and sod, packing the gaps. It was hard, grinding work, done by the light of a single, shielded lantern. The wind was high, making the lantern gutter. Eliza was moving along the slick edge of the ditch, a heavy bucket in her hand. Her foot slipped on a loose stone. She cried out, a small, breathy sound, and tumbled forward, toward the dark, rocky bottom. Rowan dropped his shovel and lunged. He caught her by the waist, his other hand grabbing her arm. He pulled her back, hard, against his chest. She was light in his arms, but solid. He held her for a second longer than he needed to, his heart pounding from the near fall. Her hand, slick with mud, was pressed against his shirt. His hand was tight on her arm. He could feel the pulse beating in her wrist. "Are you hurt?" he whispered, his voice close to her ear. She shook her head, her face turned away from him. She pulled away, gently, and picked up the bucket she had dropped. Her hands were shaking. They finished the work in silence, but the air between them had changed. It was charged, like the sky before a lightning strike. They returned to the house just before dawn, exhausted, caked in mud. They had saved the ditch. Rowan fell into a deep sleep, the first in days. He was woken by a scream. It was June. Fire. Rowan was out of bed, grabbing his rifle, his mind thick with sleep. He ran outside. The hay barn, their entire winter's feed, was burning. A dark figure on horseback was silhouetted against the bright orange flames, riding away fast. Talon was already there, throwing buckets of water from the cistern. Rowan joined him, but it was June who saved them. The horses June shrieked, running past them, unbarring the corral gate. The horses, mad with terror, thundered out, saving themselves from the spreading flames. Eliza was at the pump, working the handle with a desperate, frantic energy, filling bucket after bucket. They fought the fire for hours. It was hopeless. The hay was gone, but they had saved the barn itself and the adjoining stable. As the sun rose, they stood in a smoking, blackened ruin, their faces smeared with soot. June was crying. I heard him. She wept. I heard the horse. It was coming too quiet. Talon walked into the scorched field. He knelt. Copperjack, he said. Rowan looked. How do you know? Talon pointed. He left this. A length of rope, dropped in the haste, lay near the gate. It was tied with a specific, complex knot, a diamond hitch, but with an extra loop. This is his mark, Talon said, his voice flat and cold. He used this knot on a man I knew, a trader. He left him tied to a tree. The man was my friend. He looked at Rowan, his eyes dark with a history Rowan had never known. Copperjack owes me a debt, not for blood, for justice. I swore I would not kill him. I swore I would see him stand before the law. Rowan looked at the smoking ruins of his hay. He had lost without hay. He could not get the herd through the winter. He felt a touch on his arm. It was Eliza. She was covered in soot, her hair falling from its bun, but her eyes were clear. She held up the slate. Let me go to the clerk, please. He stared at her. Go to Dustmere after this? She shook her head. Writing again, her hand fierce. Not to beg, to look. You have old books, your father's books. Let me look at them first. He understood. She was not going to ask Tibbs for the lost patent. She was going to look for a different entry, a tax record, a bill of sale, something he had overlooked. He went to the small, metal strongbox under his bed. It held his father's papers, the few things that had survived. He took out the small, rusted key. He had never let another person touch it. He walked back to the kitchen. Eliza was washing her face at the pump. He held out the key. Eliza looked at the key, then at his face. She saw the trust he was offering. It was more profound than any touch, more intimate than any word. Her hand, still damp, closed around it. That evening, as Eliza was poring over the old, brittle ledgers by candlelight, a knock came at the door. It was Harris, the store owner, his face pale, his horse breathing hard. He pulled Rowan onto the porch. Cutter, he whispered, his voice shaking. I heard something. Beckett's men were in the saloon. They were drunk. They said the hearing was too slow. He wrung his hands. They are bringing in new men, gunmen. They are riding out day after tomorrow. They call it a final survey. They are coming to your creek. And they are not bringing measuring sticks. They are coming to take it. Harris's warning was a poison that seeped into the air of the ranch. The gunmen were coming, day after tomorrow. The words hung over the kitchen, heavier than the threat of drought. That night, the house was a fortress bracing for a siege. Rowan sat at the table, his rifle broken down, cleaning each piece with an oiled rag. The metallic scrape and click was the only sound, a sharp counterpoint to the low, steady crackle of the fire. Talon was not inside. He was a ghost, moving along the ridges, watching, listening. He had taken the first watch. Eliza sat near the hearth, the key to the strongbox on the small table beside her. She had been through Rowan's father's ledgers for hours. Her eyes ached from the spidery script, her mind numb from lists of cattle sold in 1849, of wire bought, of seed prices. She had found nothing, no tax receipt, no prior bill of sale, nothing to counter the lost patent. She was failing. The wind outside, which had blown hot and dry for weeks, suddenly stopped. The silence that fell was unnatural, suffocating. Rowan paused, his hand holding a cylinder. He looked up. Eliza lifted her head from the book. The air pressure changed. It was a feeling, a weight pressing on the skin. Then came a smell. Not dust, not pine. It was the sharp, clean smell of ozone. A low rumble, like a distant cannon, vibrated through the floorboards. The drought broke. It did not break with a gentle shower. It broke with a biblical fury. The sky tore open. Rain did not fall. It hammered the dry earth, turning the dust to instant, running mud. Thunder cracked directly overhead, a noise so violent it rattled the tin plates on the shelf. This was not a blessing. It was an assault. Rowan stood, quickly reassembling the rifle. A storm like this, it was cover. Copperjack would use this. Beckett's men would use this. They would not wait until tomorrow. They would come tonight. He grabbed his oilskin coat. "Eliza, bolt the door behind me. Do not open it for anyone." The words were barely out of his mouth when another sound ripped through the roar of the wind and rain. It was high, thin, and desperate. The bawling of calves. Panic. Talon burst through the door, his face streaming water. They cut the fence. Lower pasture, the ditch. The irrigation ditch, the one they had just repaired. The storm would turn it into a river. Rowan grabbed his rifle and ran, Talon at his heels. They plunged into the black, vertical rain. Eliza stood frozen for 1 second. She saw the open door, the lashing rain, the men gone. She heard the terror of the animals. She grabbed the big storm lantern, the one she had used in the dust storm. She lit the wick, her hands shaking, but her movements sure. She pulled her wool shawl over her head and ran after them, into the maelstrom. She was the keeper of the light. The lower pasture was a lake of churning mud. The ditch, usually a dry gash, was now a brown, foaming torrent, 6 feet wide and rising fast. Talon raised his hand. There. The fence was down. The wire, cleanly cut, curled back like dead snakes. Copperjack. In the churning water, 3 small calves were struggling, bawling, being swept downstream. Rowan swore, a raw, bitter sound. He threw his rifle to Talon. "Cover me!" He did not hesitate. He slid down the slick, muddy bank, plunging waist-deep into the freezing, fast-moving water. It was stronger than he expected, pulling at him, trying to knock him from his feet. He lunged, grabbing the first calf by its neck, and threw it bodily toward the bank. Talon dropped to one knee, snagged the animal, and hauled it to safety. Eliza arrived, holding the storm lantern high. The yellow light cut a small, brave circle in the chaos. It illuminated Rowan, his face a mask of mud, fighting the current. It illuminated Talon, scanning the dark ridgeline above them, his rifle ready. Rowan waded deeper. The second calf was further out, spinning in the current. He lunged, his boots sinking deep into the sucking mud. He got his hands on the animal, shoving it back toward Eliza. He lost his footing. A submerged rock, or a piece of debris from the hay barn, caught his ankle. The current, savage and powerful, snatched him. He went down. Talon roared his name. Rowan surfaced 10 yards downstream, gasping, coughing up muddy water. He tried to stand, but the current was too strong. He was being rolled, dragged. Eliza saw it. The man who had confessed his fear of loss, the man who had stood up to Copperjack, the man who was her anchor in this wilderness, was being taken. The girl who had hidden on the wagon train, the girl who had vowed silence, was gone. In her place was the woman who had put out a fire, led a herd through a dust storm, and faced down a rifle. She thrust the lantern at Talon. "Hold the light," she whispered. Her first word, "horse." Talon's eyes widened, but he took the lantern. Eliza ran to Rowan's horse, tied to a low branch. She ripped the lariat from the saddle. She knew this rope. She had watched him coil it, had seen the strength in it. She ran back to the bank, sliding in the mud, moving parallel to him. The water was tearing at him, pulling him toward a bend in the gully where the water was deepest and fastest. She braced herself, her small boots sinking into the bank. She threw the rope. The wind caught the loop, and it fell short. Rowan went under again. She screamed, a wordless sound of pure terror. She waded into the ditch, the freezing water swirling around her knees, stealing her breath. She pulled the rope back, her hands raw. He surfaced, closer now, his face pale, his eyes wide with shock. She threw again, not with her arms, but with her whole body, a desperate heave of prayer and sinew. The loop sailed true. It slapped the water just in front of him. He got an arm through it. She locked her hands, digging her heels in. The rope went taut. The force of the man in the water was immense. She was pulled forward, sliding into the ditch. Then Talon was beside her. He grabbed the rope, his strength a solid wall. Together, they pulled, they dragged him, hand over hand, fighting the mud, fighting the water, until he was on the bank, a gasping, broken heap on the wet grass. He was alive, but he was hurt. "My shoulder," he groaned, his voice a low rasp. He was clutching his left arm. In the swaying, chaotic light of the lantern, Eliza saw the blood. It was dark, pumping from a wound near his collarbone. He had been slammed against the rocks. She fell to her knees beside him. Her shawl was gone, her hair a muddy rope plastered to her face. She was shaking so hard, her teeth chattered. Talon had the rifle up, scanning the ridge. I saw him. Copper Jack. He was watching. Rowan tried to sit up. "We have to gunman." Eliza pushed him back down. She ripped a long strip from the hem of her thick wool skirt. She had to apply pressure. She had to stop the bleeding. She pushed his wet coat and shirt aside. And she saw it, the old, puckered, silver scar from the border war. His history, his pain, and right beside it, a fresh, deep gash, torn open by the rocks. Welling dark blood that the rain could not wash away. She did not hesitate. She balled the cloth in her fist and planted her small, cold, muddy hand directly on the wound, covering the old scar and the new injury. She pressed down with all her weight. It was a bold touch, not gentle, not comforting. It was a touch of preservation. Rowan cried out, a sharp gasp. It was not just the pain. It was the shock. Her hand on that place, on the mark of his deepest failure. It was an anchor. It was a seal. It was stopping his life from pouring out into the mud. He looked up at her. Her face was inches from his. He could see the terror in her eyes, but also a fire that burned brighter than the lantern. He was shivering, his body going into shock. He was losing the fight. His vision was blurring. "Eliza," he chattered, his teeth knocking. "You have to run. Get June. The hearth, it is just wood. Leave it." He was giving up. The fear he had confessed to her was winning. He was letting go. She saw it. She saw him leaving, not just the ranch, but leaving them. She grabbed his shirt with her free hand, shaking him, her face fierce. The dam of her silence, the wall she had built from the stones of her grief and fear, shattered. The words, the voice she had held prisoner for years, tore from her throat. No, the sound was raw, a rusted thing. Rowan's eyes focused. He stared at her, thinking he was delirious. "Do not leave the hearth," she said, her voice shaking, but gaining power with every word. "Do not leave us." The words struck him with the force of the flood. He stopped shivering. He looked at this woman, this muddy, drowned, fierce creature who was holding him together with her bare hands. Who was speaking? For him. His good hand, his right hand, came up. He covered her hand on his shoulder. He felt her trembling. Or maybe he was the one trembling. "I am home," he whispered. He was not talking about the ranch. At that moment, Talon returned. He slid down the bank, his face grim. "He is gone." He ran when he saw I was not fooled, but he left this. He held up a length of rope, the rope that had been used to cut the fence, tied in a diamond hitch with an extra loop. The proof. Rowan was fading. Talon helped him to his feet. Eliza never let go of his shoulder. She was his crutch. Together, the three of them, a wounded, muddy, but unbroken line, made their way back to the house. June was at the window, her face a pale white circle. She opened the door. Eliza took command. Her silence was gone, and in its place was a quiet, unshakable authority. "Get the whiskey," she told June, her voice rough but clear, "and the sewing needle, now." She pushed Rowan into the chair by the fire, the one he always sat in. She stripped his wet coat off. Talon held the lantern. The wound was deep, but the bleeding had slowed. "She washed it with whiskey," Rowan hissed, his knuckles white. "Talon, hold him," she commanded. She threaded the needle. Her hands, which had been shaking, were now rock steady. She began to stitch the wound, her movements as small and precise as the ones she used on his torn shirts. He did not look away. He watched her face. He watched the concentration in her eyes, the set of her jaw. She was mending him. When she was done, she bandaged him tightly with a clean rag. He was pale, exhausted, but his eyes were clear. Talon looked at him. "The gunmen come with the sunrise. You cannot ride." Rowan looked at Eliza. She was standing by the desk, looking at the key to the strongbox, her mind already moving. "He will not have to," she said. She turned to Talon. "The trapper, Old Man Hemlock. I need you to get him. Bring him to Dustmere, to the courthouse, today." Talon nodded, and this he held up the rope. "Give it to the judge," she said. "Tell him it belongs to Copper Jack." After Talon had ridden out, disappearing into the pre-dawn light, Eliza checked on Rowan. He was in his bed, his face gray with pain. "Eliza," he said. She stood in the doorway. "You saved me." She nodded, her hand at her throat, as if feeling the strange, new vibration of her own voice. "Your voice," he said, "it is beautiful." She looked at the floor, a flush rising in her pale cheeks. She was afraid of this new world, this new self. He held out his good hand. "We will after this, after the hearing." She knew what he was asking. It was not just about the ranch. It was about the hearth, about us. She looked at him, and for the first time, she did on purpose what she had done by accident in the storm. She smiled, a small, slow, tired smile. She nodded. She left him to rest and walked back to the main room. The storm was over. The sky to the east was a pale, bruised purple. The rain had washed the world clean. She knelt by the hearth. The fire was almost out, just a pile of dull, red embers. She took a small piece of kindling and blew on them, gently. A small flame caught. She added a larger log. The fire began to burn, bright and steady, pushing back the chill. She heard a small sound. June was standing there, her thin nightgown clutched in her hands. She had seen it all. The blood, the needle, the new voice. Eliza, exhausted, covered in mud, her dress torn, looked at the girl. June walked across the room. She did not speak. She just wrapped her small arms around Eliza's waist and buried her face in her dirty, wet apron. Eliza's hands, which had stitched a wound and held a man back from the flood, came to rest on June's hair. "Sister," June whispered into the folds of the apron. "You are my sister." Eliza closed her eyes. She held the child tight, the first light of morning filling the kitchen, the hearth fire burning bright. The courthouse in Dustmere was not a grand building. It was a single-story clapboard structure, smelling of unseasoned pine, stale tobacco, and nervous sweat. But on this day, it felt like the center of the world. It was packed. Ranchers, speculators, and townsfolk stood along the walls, their faces grim. They were not here for the law. They were here for the spectacle, to see if Rowan Cutter, the last of the old valley ranchers, would finally be broken. Rowan sat at a small table at the front. His left arm was bound tightly in a clean white sling. The stitches Eliza had sewn pulling painfully with every breath. He was pale, his face etched with exhaustion and pain, but his eyes were clear and hard. Eliza sat beside him. She was no longer the silent cook. She was a woman who had spoken, a woman who had fought. Her hands were folded on the table, her back straight. June sat on the bench just behind them, her small hands clutching a piece of wood Eliza had given her to hold. At the other table sat Silas Beckett, looking comfortable in his wool suit, and his lawyer, Mr. Finch. They were flanked by Mr. Tibbs, the county clerk, who was visibly sweating, his eyes darting between Beckett and the judge. Judge Harlan entered. He was an older man, his face carved by years on the frontier, his eyes holding no patience for fools. He banged his gavel. This court is in session. This is a preliminary hearing on the matter of the Western Development and Railroad Company versus Mr. Rowan Cutter. The issue is the water rights to the spring in Section 12. Mr. Finch, you may begin. Finch stood, his voice smooth. Your Honor, the facts are simple. The railroad, in its vital mission to bring progress to this territory, has filed a claim on Parcel 13. Our new official survey, which I have here, clearly shows the headwaters of the creek in question originate on our land. He placed a large, new map on the judge's desk. It was professionally drawn, full of precise lines and official-looking stamps. Mr. Cutter's claim is based on memory and, unfortunately, a misplaced patent. The judge looked at the map. He frowned. Mr. Cutter. Rowan began to stand, but Eliza put a hand on his good arm, stopping him. She stood instead. The courtroom murmured. The silent woman. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it was as clear and cold as the water they were fighting for. Your Honor, that map is a lie. Beckett's head snapped toward her. Finch's smile wavered. Eliza walked to the judge's desk. She placed her own notebook, the one from the courthouse, beside Beckett's map. This, Your Honor, is a copy I made from the county atlas 1 week ago, before Mr. Beckett's men had a chance to alter the original. She pointed. You can see here. The line of the creek is different. The spring is clearly, and has always been, on the Cutter property. Finch sputtered. Your Honor, this is absurd. A hand-drawn sketch from an interested party. Judge Harlan looked at Eliza's drawing. He saw the precision in the lines, the confidence in the script. He looked at Tibbs. Mr. Tibbs, I ordered you to bring the county atlas. Tibbs wiped his face with a handkerchief. It seems to have been misplaced as well. Your Honor, a terrible state of affairs in that archive. Beckett's man, Eliza said, her voice steady. He threatened me in the street. Another man, working for him, set fire to our hay barn. Last night, they cut our fences and tried to drown our calves. This is an outrage, Finch shouted. She has no proof. A quiet voice came from the back of the courtroom. I have proof. The crowd parted. Talon Greyhawk walked forward. He was not dressed for court. He wore his buckskins, and he moved with a silence that unnerved the entire room. He was followed by a very old man, his skin like wrinkled leather, smelling of pine smoke and damp earth. This is Old Man Hemlock, Talon said. He was here before the maps. Hemlock looked at the judge, his eyes cloudy but sane. I trapped this valley when it was only Cheyenne land. I knew Rowan Cutter's father. I helped him set his first boundary stones. He did not use a map. He used the land, He marked his corner by the 3 tall pines on the ridge and the old eagle's nest on the cliff. "The spring," he said, his voice a dry rustle, "has always belonged to that patch of land. It is Cutter land." The judge leaned forward, his eyes fixed on Hemlock. He trusted the trapper's words more than the lawyer's. "This is hearsay," Finch protested, "a senile old man's memory." Judge Harlan slammed his gavel. Silence. He looked at the 2 maps. He looked at the nervous clerk. He looked at Rowan, wounded but defiant. "I have 2 maps, both disputed. I have a memory of stones, and I have a county clerk who cannot seem to find a single piece of paper I ask for." He glared at Tibbs, who shrank in his chair. "Mr. Tibbs, you will tell me right now which map is the true one." Tibbs looked at Beckett. He saw the cold promise in the man's eyes. He looked at the judge. He looked at Talon. He licked his lips. I can only trust the official survey. Your Honor, the new one. It must be an update." The judge's face hardened. He knew he was being lied to. "Very well." He stood. "This hearing is suspended. The injunction against Mr. Cutter stands for now. But this will not be decided by paper. It will be decided by stone. Tomorrow, at dawn. I will ride out to Section 12 myself. I will have Mr. Hemlock show me these boundary markers. This court will see the land with its own eyes." He hit the gavel. Adjourned. Rowan felt a cold dread. One more day. He had to hold on for one more day. They gathered their things. Eliza took June's hand. They walked out of the courthouse, a small, embattled family, into the hostile town. Talon moved close. "We leave now. We do not stop." The ride back to the ranch was a nightmare. The sky, which had been clear, turned a bruised, sickly green. The air grew heavy and cold. The first storm had been water. This one was ice. They were in the open wagon. Rowan, Eliza, and June. Rowan's injured shoulder throbbed with the coming storm. He was holding his rifle awkwardly on his lap, his good hand tense. Talon was on horseback, scouting 50 yards ahead. They were halfway home, in a narrow cut between 2 low mesas. When Talon's hand shot up, he wheeled his horse, yelling, "Ambush." The first shot kicked up dirt by the wagon wheel. The horses screamed and reared. June shrieked. Rowan grabbed her, pulling her down to the wagon bed. "Eliza, get the reins!" But the attack was fast. 3 riders boiled out from the rocks, their faces covered by bandanas. A 4th, a big man on a heavy horse with a chipped shoe, was leading them, Copperjack. Rowan fired, the recoil agonizing against his wounded shoulder. He missed. A bullet tore through the wooden side of the wagon, splintering it. Talon was firing from the rocks, a phantom, drawing their attention. Eliza grabbed June. The wagon was a trap. Into the rocks she screamed. She pushed June off the wagon, tumbling with her into a shallow ditch as the horses, panicked, bolted. Rowan rolled out the other side, landing hard on his bad arm. A cry of pure agony was ripped from his throat. He lay in the mud, his rifle just out of reach. Helpless. One of the riders saw him. He grinned, raising his pistol for an easy shot. From the rocks, Eliza saw it. She remembered Talon's lesson. She shoved June behind a large boulder. "Stay down." She pulled the small signal whistle from her pocket. She blew it, a piercing, shrill sound. At the same time, she held up the storm lantern she had insisted on bringing, its light a bright target. It was a desperate gamble, drawing the rider's attention away from Rowan. It worked. The gunman turned, confused by the light and sound, and fired at her. The bullet sparked off the rock above her head. That second of distraction was all Rowan needed. He grabbed his rifle with his good hand and fired from the ground. The rider clutched his chest and fell. As this happened, the sky opened. Hail. Not small pellets, but ice stones the size of bullets, hammered down, adding a new roaring chaos to the fight. "Talon!" seeing his chance, spurred his horse directly at Copperjack. This was not about the ranch anymore. This was about the man tied to the tree. It was a brutal, close-quarters fight in the middle of the blinding hailstorm. Talon launched himself from his horse, tackling Copperjack to the ground. They rolled in the ice and mud. Copperjack was bigger, stronger. He drew his knife. But Talon was faster, fueled by a cold, righteous fury. He twisted, breaking the man's wrist. The knife flew. Talon got his own knife to Copperjack's throat. The man stared up, his eyes full of hate. "Do it," he spat. Talon breathed, the hail stinging his face. He saw his friend's face. He saw his own promise. He lowered the knife. He pulled the man's hands behind his back. He took the length of evidence rope from his belt. "Justice," he said, pulling the knot tight, "not blood." The other two riders, seeing their leader captured and one man down, fled into the storm. Silence fell, broken only by the roar of the hail. Eliza ran from the rocks, pulling June. They found Rowan. He was sitting up, his face ashen. A dark stain was spreading on the sleeve of his good arm. He had been grazed, a shallow, bloody furrow. He looked at Eliza, his vision blurring. Both arms, he whispered, a grim, defeated laugh. She tore another strip from her skirt. Her hands were shaking, but she bandaged the new wound tightly. She and June, one on each side, hauled him to his feet. They made it back to the ranch house under the cover of darkness. They were a broken-looking group, covered in mud, ice, and blood, but they were alive. That night, Eliza sat by the hearth, rebandaging Rowan's graze. June was asleep, exhausted. Talon was in Dustmere, handing a bound and furious Copperjack over to the stunned deputy, along with the evidence rope and a cold promise to the judge. Rowan watched Eliza's hands. They were so small, yet they had held him together. "Eliza," he said, his voice quiet, "this is not my ranch anymore." She looked up, confused. "It is ours." He nodded toward his father's strongbox, the one she still had the key for. "Get the ledger, the big one." She brought it. He had her turn to a blank page near the back. "Write this," he said. He dictated, his voice slow but steady. "Let it be known that the Cutter Ranch and all its holdings, including land, brand, and water, are hereby held in equal partnership by Rowan Cutter and by Eliza Hale." She wrote, her beautiful script filling the page. It was not a legal document. It was a vow. He made her date it. He took the pen, his bandaged, clumsy right hand shaking, and he signed his name. He pushed the book to her. Eliza looked at the words. She looked at him. She saw the absolute trust in his eyes. She dipped the pen in the inkwell, and beside his name, she wrote her own. They were partners, bound by ink and blood. In Dustmere, Silas Beckett was in the saloon, his fury a palpable thing. The judge was going to the site. Hemlock was a problem, and Copperjack had been arrested. He met with 3 new men, hard-faced men who had arrived on the evening stage. "They are riding out at dawn," he said, his voice low. "The judge and his party. I do not care about Cutter. I care about that judge. Make sure he does not make it to that creek." In the alley outside, Talon heard every word. He had delivered his prisoner and had been watching, waiting. He knew the town marshal was in Beckett's pocket. He slipped away. He did not go to the jail. He rode east, toward the small outpost of territorial regulators, the one group Beckett could not buy. And in the hotel, Judge Harlan was preparing for bed, his mind heavy. He knew Tibbs had lied. He knew the case was rotten. A piece of paper slid under his door. He picked it up. It was an anonymous note, the handwriting shaky. "The new map is a forgery. I was there. Tibbs was paid. The ink on the atlas was changed. Please, look at the stones." The judge stared at the note. One of his men, one of Beckett's own, had cracked. He now had a witness, a warning, and a confession. He put the note in his pocket. The sun would be up in a few hours. The dawn broke cold and clean. The hailstorm had scrubbed the air, leaving the world smelling of wet sage and pine. There was no wagon. Rowan, his arms both bandaged, his left in a sling, his right bound tightly, was helped onto his most steady horse by Eliza. He was in no condition to ride, but he would be there. Eliza rode beside him. She had her hair tied back, and she wore her plain gray dress, but she looked taller. Her voice was still new to her, and she used it sparingly. But the silence was no longer a prison. It was a choice. June, refusing to be left behind, rode on a small pony, her face set with a child's serious resolve. Judge Harlan met them at the edge of the property. He was not alone. He had his nervous notary, a man named Peters, an old man Hemlock, who looked more comfortable on his mule than he had in the courthouse. But they were not the only ones. A line of 6 men, riders with territorial regulator badges on their vests, sat on their horses. Their captain, a man with a clean-shaven jaw and cold eyes, nodded to Rowan. Talon Greyhawk was with them. He had done his work. He had brought the law that could not be bought. Silas Beckett and his lawyer, Finch, were already there. Beckett looked furious. The presence of the regulators was a surprise, and not a pleasant one. Mr. Tibbs, the county clerk, was with them, looking as if he were being marched to his own execution. Judge Harlan wasted no time. "Mr. Hemlock, you are our guide." Hemlock nodded, kicking his mule forward. He led them away from the new false survey stakes, away from the forged map's lines. He led them up a low ridge, his eyes on the land, not on the men. He was reading a different kind of map, one made of memory and time. He stopped at the crest. "You see there," he said, his reedy voice cutting through the morning chill. He pointed. Below them, in a small, sheltered fold of the land, stood a massive, ancient cottonwood tree, its leaves just beginning to turn yellow. "That is the marker," Hemlock said. "The old man, Cutter's father, he called it the Great Tree. We set the first stone right at its base." They rode down. The judge dismounted. He walked to the tree and, pushing aside the brush, he found it, a tall, upright stone, dark with age, with a simple C chiseled into its face. Finch protested, his voice high. "A rock, Your Honor. This is folklore, not law." The judge ignored him. He looked at the notary. "You will record this." "The stone, the tree." Hemlock led them on. Following the line of the ridge, he found the second marker, a pile of 3 large stones. The 3 sisters, he called them. And from that marker, he pointed down into the gully. "And there is the spring," he said. "It runs from the rock right below us. It has always been Cutter land." The forged map, the one Beckett had paid for, would have placed them a half-mile east, on land Beckett owned. The old trapper, with the land's own memory, had exposed the lie. Rowan sat on his horse, the relief so profound he felt dizzy. He looked at Eliza. She was watching the spring, the source of all their trouble. A small, beautiful pool of clear water bubbling from the rocks. As the notary was scribbling in his book, Talon spoke, his voice quiet. "Judge, there is more." He led them down to the creek bed, just below the spring. The ground was torn up, the mud scored by hoof prints and boot marks, and there, blocking the main flow of the new, rain-swollen stream, was a hastily built dam of rocks and logs, designed to divert the water away from Rowan's pastures. Beckett scoffed. A beaver dam, perhaps. Talon reached into the muddy logs. He pulled something free, a length of rope, cut and left behind. He held it up. Eliza gasped. It was the rope, the one that had cut the fence, the one that had been dropped at the hay barn, and tied in it, clear and unmistakable, was the diamond hitch with the extra loop. "This is the knot of copperjack," Talon said, his voice flat. He offered the rope to the judge. The man who set this dam is the same man who burned the hay, the same man who attacked this family last night. Judge Harlan took the rope. He looked at Beckett. The man's face was no longer angry. It was pale. "This is circumstantial," Finch bleated. "You cannot connect this to my client." "You do not have to," a new voice said. It was the captain of the regulators. He was holding a piece of paper. The anonymous note, "We have a signed confession from one of your own men, Mr. Beckett, a man who was supposed to be part of an ambush on the judge this morning." He looked at Tibbs. The clerk let out a small, choked sound and sank to his knees. "He paid me," Tibbs cried, his voice cracking. "He paid me to lose the patent. He paid me to change the map in the atlas. I did not know about the killing. I swear I did not." Beckett turned. His face was a mask of cold fury. He saw his escape route, the way his buggy had come. He took one step. Two regulators moved, their rifles leveling. "Silas Beckett," the captain said, his voice ringing in the canyon. "You are under arrest for conspiracy to commit fraud, attempted murder, and intimidation of a federal court." Beckett stared at the rifles, and all the fight, all the false power, drained out of him. He was just a man in a wool suit, standing in the mud. Finch stood with his mouth open, his papers fluttering in his hand. The judge looked at Rowan. He looked at Eliza. He looked at the spring. "The injunction is hereby and permanently lifted," he declared. "The court recognizes the boundary markers as described by Mr. Hemlock. The water and the land belong to the partnership of Cutter and Hale." He turned to the regulators. "Take these men and Mr. Tibbs back to town. They will be held for the federal circuit." He looked at the bound rope in his hand. "This," he said, "will be added to the case against Copperjack." As the regulators led the men away, the gray sky, which had held its breath all morning, finally let go. A soft, gentle rain began to fall. It was not a storm. It was a cleansing. It washed the mud from the rocks and the dust from the leaves. Rowan, Eliza, and June rode home. They did not speak. There were no words for the feeling. It was not just victory. It was peace. When they reached the ranch, Talon was waiting on the porch. He had not ridden back with them. He had followed the regulators, to be sure. Rowan, his body screaming with pain, was helped down by Talon. He looked at his friend. "I do not have the words," Rowan said. Talon smiled, a rare, warm expression. He put his hand on Rowan's good shoulder. "You have water. You have a home. That is all the words you need." Rowan nodded. He walked into the house, leaning heavily on Eliza. He sank into his chair by the hearth, the chair she had stitched him in, the chair where he had seen her hold June. He was exhausted, but he was home. Eliza moved to the stove. It was her first instinct. The hearth. She knelt, checking the wood she had laid that morning. It was dry. She struck a match. The kindling caught, and a bright, steady fire began to burn, pushing back the damp chill of the rain. The heart of the house was lit. She stood, and June was there. The girl was holding a small, folded piece of cloth. She held it out to Eliza. It was a kitchen towel, a simple piece of old flour sack, washed soft, but in the center, in thick, clumsy, bright red thread, June had embroidered a single, large letter, C. Eliza's fingers, raw from the rope and the reins, traced the stitching. "It is for Cutter," June whispered, her eyes shining, and she pointed to the stove. "For Cook." Eliza felt the last of the ice around her own heart break. She pulled the small girl into her arms, burying her face in June's hair. She held her, the way she had held on to Rowan in the flood, the way she had held on to her own silence. But this was not about fear. This was about belonging. Rowan watched them from his chair, the firelight playing on his face. Talon stood on the porch, outside the circle of light, looking in. He watched the woman, the child, and the wounded man. He saw the firelight glinting off the simple tin plates. He saw the safety, the justice, the home they had all built. He had kept his vow to his friend. He had brought the law. The bridge between the worlds was standing. For today. He smiled, turned, and walked out into the gentle, healing rain. The weeks that followed the confrontation at the spring were a time of strange, quiet healing. The land itself, washed clean by the rain and the hail, seemed to take a deep, contented breath. The spring, now undisputed, ran full and clear into the repaired irrigation ditches. The valley was alive. Rowan's body healed slowly. His shoulder was stiff. The new scar laid beside the old one, a testament to a different kind of war. His right arm, grazed by the bullet, was a lesser wound but a constant reminder of how close they had come to losing everything. He could not lift a shovel or swing a rope, so he was forced to direct, to trust. And the community, which had watched from the sidelines, finally stepped in. The fight at the saloon, the arrest of Beckett, and the courage of the silent woman who had spoken. It had broken the town's fever of fear. One morning, Rowan looked out to see a line of wagons coming up the road. It was not gunmen. It was Harris, the store owner, and the blacksmith, and 2 ranchers from the next valley over. They brought lumber, they brought food, they came to help rebuild the burned hay barn and mend the cut fences. It was a strange reversal for Rowan, a man who had never asked for help. He sat on the porch, his arms bound, watching his neighbors raise the new beams. Eliza, true to her nature, took charge of the feeding. Her kitchen, the heart of the ranch, expanded its reach. She built a long fire pit in the yard, roasting meat and baking bread in Dutch ovens, feeding the small army of volunteers. The smell of her cooking, of thyme and smoke and fresh yeast, became the smell of reconstruction. Talon Greyhawk stayed for 3 days, his presence a quiet guarantee of the new peace. He sat with Rowan on the porch, watching the work. "The water is safe," Rowan said, his voice thick with gratitude. Talon nodded, looking toward the mountains. "The water is safe from Beckett, but it is not safe from the next drought." He pointed to the north, where the high ridges lay. "My people camp there. They, too, need the spring." Rowan was quiet. The old instinct, the one that had made him fight for every drop, bristled. Talon looked at him. "You fought for the land. You did not fight to become the man you defeated." Beckett wanted to own the water. A man who owns water is just a different kind of thief. Rowan looked at Eliza, who was handing a hot plate to the blacksmith. He saw the wisdom in Talon's words. He had not fought for ownership. He had fought for his home. That night, Rowan, Eliza, and Talon gathered at the kitchen table. They took out the ledger, the one that held their partnership agreement. On a new page, they drafted a new document. It was not a legal paper. It was an agreement, simple and clear. It established the boundaries of the Cutter and Hale Ranch. But it also set aside protected access to the spring for the Lakota and Cheyenne camps. It was not a treaty, it was a promise. Water was for sharing. On the 4th day, Judge Harlan himself rode out. He did not come on official business. He tied his horse and walked to the porch, taking off his hat. He accepted a cup of coffee from Eliza. He looked at her, his eyes kind. "Miss Hale, I came to tell you that Copperjack has been tried, convicted, and sent to the territorial prison. Your testimony, the old warrant from Missouri, and Talon's rope. It was a closed case. Beckett and Tibbs will face the circuit judge next month. They will not be coming back." Rowan let out a breath he felt he had been holding for a year. "It is over." The judge turned to Eliza. "It is over because you had the courage to speak. Ma'am, you came to a courthouse full of armed men and you spoke the truth. This valley owes you a debt." Eliza, who had found her voice in a moment of terror, now found it in a moment of peace. Her words were still quiet, chosen with the same care she used for her ingredients. "I only said what was true. Your Honor, the land it remembers. We just had to listen. Her voice had become a part of the house. She no longer used the slate, but she did not become a talkative woman. She remained economical with her words, as if she knew each one had weight. She spoke to June, her voice soft as she helped with her letters. She spoke to Rowan, her tone clear and direct when they discussed the ranch. But mostly, her new voice was heard in the kitchen, humming a low tune as she kneaded dough, a sound as comforting as the crackle of the fire itself. Rowan's fear, the one of being tricked by paper, did not disappear. It was a deep-rooted thing. He sat at his desk one evening, staring at a new shipping contract for cattle. His brow furrowed, his good hand rubbing his temple. He felt the old, familiar shame of confusion. Eliza came and stood beside him. She did not take the paper from him. She gently pulled up a chair. "What does this word mean?" she asked, pointing heretofore. "I am not sure," he admitted. She opened a large, worn dictionary, a book that had been her father's. "It means before this time. So the contract is talking about all costs." Together, they read it, line by line. She was not reading it for him. She was teaching him. He felt the old shame recede, replaced by a new, shared strength. This was her true authority, the one he had given her with the key. She was not just his partner in the ledger. She was his partner in understanding. He gave her full control of the ranch accounts, the seed orders, the ledgers she understood so much better than he. The strongbox was now theirs. The morning came when Talon had to leave. He had packed his few belongings onto his horse, the animal lean and ready for a long journey. Rowan met him by the corral, his own arms now free from the sling, though he still moved stiffly. "Your bridge is built," Rowan said. Talon nodded. "It is, but there are other valleys, other men like Beckett. My people need a voice, a peacemaker, in the Wyoming territory." Rowan held out his hand. "I am in your debt, my friend." Talon clasped his hand, a grip of iron. "No debt. You shared the water. You are a brother to the land now, not just its master." He reached into his belt and pulled out a knife. It was not a weapon, but a tool. The handle carved from a piece of antler, the blade small and sharp. "This is for a man who builds, not for one who fights, to carve a new home, to protect your hearth." Rowan took the gift, his throat tight. He watched as Talon Greyhawk mounted his horse. The Lakota warrior looked at the ranch house, at the new chimney smoke rising straight into the blue morning sky. He nodded once, then turned his horse and rode east, toward the rising sun, never looking back. Life in Dustmere changed. The fall of Silas Beckett, a man who had seemed as powerful as the railroad itself, had broken the town's spirit of greed. When Rowan and Eliza next rode in for supplies, the air was different. People nodded to them. They tipped their hats to Eliza. Harris, the store owner, pressed a bag of coffee beans into her hand. On the house, Miss Hale. For everything. They passed the saloon. A young man was on a ladder, hanging a new, painted sign above the bat-wing doors. The crude old sign was gone. This one read, "The Honest Cup. All patrons welcome. No incitement. No discrimination." A young man in city spectacles and a clean, if rumpled, suit approached them. "Mr. Cutter, Miss Hale. My name is Thomas Reed. I am a lawyer. New to town." Rowan tensed, his hand instinctively moving to his side. No, the man said, holding up his hands. "I came here because of what you did. I was in the courthouse that day. I am reviewing all the land deeds in the county. Pro bono, for free. Making sure the maps are right, making sure this never happens again." Eliza looked at the young, earnest man. "That is good work. Mr. Reed," she said, her voice clear. They rode home, the wagon full. The seeds of the future they had planted were already beginning to sprout. June, now a confident reader, had taken the 3 children of their new ranch hands under her wing. She held class every afternoon on the porch, her small primer in her lap, her voice serious as she pointed out the letters. Eliza had found a new purpose in town. Every Sunday, she took the wagon to the abandoned meeting hall. She lit the fire in its cold kitchen, and she baked. She baked for the town. She set up a Sunday kitchen, offering bread and hot soup to anyone who came. On a small shelf by the stove, she placed her father's dictionary, her copy of Shakespeare, and a book of poetry. It was the first library in Dustmere. That evening, the work was done. June was asleep. The new ranch hands were quiet in the bunkhouse. Rowan stood on the porch, looking out at the valley. His valley. Their valley. The sky was a deep velvet purple, scattered with a million stars. He felt a peace he had not known since he was a boy. Eliza came out, wiping her hands on the towel June had made her. She stood beside him, her shoulder almost touching his. "My mother loved the stars," Rowan said, his voice quiet. She used to say this porch was the finest ballroom in the territory. He turned to her. He was still awkward, a man of cattle and fences, not of words. His arms were scarred. His heart was scarred. "I am not a dancing man, Eliza, and my body is still healing." Eliza looked up at him, the man who had confessed his fears, who had signed his name next to hers. "So is mine," she whispered. He held out his right hand, the one that had been grazed. She placed her hand in his. It was not the desperate, muddy grip in the flood. It was not the fleeting spark at the desk. It was a choice, a quiet and solid promise. He drew her close. He put his other hand on her waist, awkwardly, gently. He could hear a faint harmonica tune drifting from the bunkhouse. They swayed. It was not a dance. It was a slow, shuffling rhythm, a shared breath. They moved in a small circle on the worn porch planks, under the vast, starry sky. He was stiff, and she was careful. 2 survivors learning to stand together. He rested his cheek against her hair, and he smelled the faint, clean scent of flour and soap. It was the smell of home. The wedding was not held in a church. It was held under the broad, sheltering arms of the great cottonwood tree, the ancient marker that had anchored their claim. The land itself was their witness, the stones their foundation. Judge Harlan, in a rare act of personal kindness, had agreed to officiate. He stood with his book, his back to the massive trunk. The small community gathered. Harris, the storekeeper, the blacksmith, the young lawyer Thomas Reed, and the ranchers who had helped rebuild the barn. They were not just spectators. They were a community, reformed. Rowan stood tall. He was still stiff, his left arm moving carefully, but his face was not the weary, haunted mask it had once been. He wore a clean shirt, his father's. June stood beside him, her hair tied with a blue ribbon, holding a handful of wild prairie flowers. Eliza walked toward him. She wore her simple blue calico dress, the one she had worn when she first began to teach June. It was clean and pressed. She had no veil, no jewels. Her wealth was in the new, quiet confidence in her eyes. Talon Greyhawk stood beside Rowan. He had waited, delaying his journey for this. He was the bridge, the one who had connected the old ways of the land to the new ways of the law, the one who had shown them a path between justice and revenge. The judge kept his words brief. "We are here," he said, his voice carrying in the clean, open air, not just to join 2 people, but to recognize what has already been forged, in fire, in flood, and in the fight for what is right. Rowan turned to Eliza. His voice was rough but steady. "I thought I was fighting for this land," he said, looking at the valley. "But I was wrong. I was fighting for the hearth, for the fire you built. My vow is to keep that fire safe." Eliza looked up at the man whose scars she had touched, whose wounds she had mended. Her voice was quiet, but every person there strained to hear it. "I came to this place seeking shelter," she said. "I found a home. My vow is to the hearth. and to the water, to keep the fire, and to share the bounty. Judge Harlan nodded. By the laws of this territory, and by the older, deeper laws of this land, I pronounce you partners, partners in this ranch, and partners in life. Rowan, with his scarred right hand, took her hand. He did not kiss her. It was not a gesture they understood. Instead, he gently brushed his knuckles against her cheek, a promise of protection, a sign of profound respect. Back at the ranch, the celebration was not a party, it was a feast. Eliza, with the help of the other ranch wives, had covered the long tables in food. It was a testament to the safety and the bounty she had brought. There was bread, and stew, and apple pies. Rowan waited until everyone had eaten. He walked to the new, unscorched barn, and returned carrying a wide plank of pine. He hung it above the porch door, where it would be the first thing any visitor saw. He had carved it himself, his good hand aching, using the antler-handled knife Talon had given him. The letters were deep and clear. Cutter and Hale. And underneath, he had added 3 small words. Bread, brand, bridge. The crowd murmured their approval. Bread, for the hearth she kept. Brand, for the cattle he protected. Bridge, for the new alliance they had built. With the law, with the community, and with the land's first people. Rowan looked at the sign, then at the men and women watching. He saw Harris, who had given him the warning. He saw Judge Harlan, who had chosen truth over power. He knew, in that moment, that justice was not the same as victory. Victory was what Beckett had wanted. It was loud, and it was temporary. Justice was what they had achieved. It was quiet, it was shared, and it was built to last. He had not won by outdrawing Copperjack. He had won by outlasting him, by using the truth, by trusting the community, and by listening to the woman beside him. The best fence, he realized, was not made of wire. It was made of honest neighbors. The next morning, the sun was a sliver of red on the eastern horizon. Rowan, Eliza, and June stood on the porch, the air cold and sharp. Talon was on his horse, a lean silhouette against the growing light. "The task is done," Talon said. He looked at the ranch, at the new barn, at the secure fences. "Keep the fire hot. Rowan Cutter." He turned his gaze to Eliza. "Share the water. Eliza Hale." He did not say goodbye. He simply nodded, a final sign of respect, and turned his horse. He rode east, toward the new day, not once looking back. They watched him until he was a small, dark speck against the prairie sunrise. As his shape vanished, a sound rose from the grasslands, the clear, liquid song of a meadowlark, a sudden burst of music in the vast, quiet morning. Eliza smiled. It was the sound of freedom. Life settled into a new, steady rhythm. The ranch prospered, but it was changed. Eliza's kitchen remained its heart, and she, its storyteller. She found that her voice, now free, had a new purpose. It was to heal her own memories. She was kneading bread one afternoon, June beside her, her small hands covered in flour. "This," Eliza said, her hands moving in the familiar, comforting rhythm. "This is my mother's recipe. She was a strong woman. She taught me that bread is not just food, it is patience." June watched her, her eyes wide. "You do miss her?" Eliza paused, her hands still. "Every day," she said, her voice soft. "But when I make this, I do not remember the wagon or the dust. I remember her laughing. I remember her hands, right here, in the flour." She had reclaimed her past. She had taken the ghosts of her trauma and given them a seat at her table, not as monsters, but as memories. She would touch the sack of cornmeal and smile, remembering the fire she had beaten out and the dust storm she had faced. She looked at the dried apples, and she did not just see a pie. She saw the night she and Rowan had first truly talked, when she had told him that home was the people by the hearth. Each meal was a memory. each recipe a chapter. Her voice, once locked in terror, was now the sound of healing. Rowan, too, was healing. He rode out one afternoon in late fall, the wind sharp from the north, carrying the first premonition of snow. It was the same wind that had always made his old bullet wound ache, a deep, pulling throb of guilt and memory. He was on the high ridge, the one where Hemlock had shown them the true line. He was not carrying his rifle. He had the carving knife from Talon at his belt. He looked down at his valley. Their valley. The water was flowing, a bright silver ribbon, full and clean. He could see the new ditch, the one that ran north, toward the high country, the one that fulfilled his promise to Talon. His cattle were fat and healthy, grazing peacefully. He saw the new calves, the ones saved from the flood, playing in the lower pasture. The cold wind hit him, sharp and biting. He braced himself for the pain. He waited. Nothing. He stopped his horse. He put his good hand, the one that was no longer grazed, up to his left shoulder. He pressed his fingers against the thick, ropey scar. He felt the cold of the wind on his skin. He felt the old, tough ridge of healed flesh. But the ache was gone. The old, deep throb, the one that had been his companion for 10 years, was silent. He let out a long, slow breath, and the wind carried it away. That evening, the first true cold of winter settled in, but inside the ranch house, the kitchen was bright and hot. The big stove radiated warmth. June was at the table. She was not reading her simple primer. Spread before her was the new, official map of the ranch, the one drawn by Thomas Reed and certified by the judge. Rowan and Eliza sat by the fire, listening. June's voice was clear and proud. It reads, "The Cutter and Hale Partnership, Parcel Section 12, commencing at the Great Cottonwood Tree. GPS coordinates." She stumbled on the word coordinates. Eliza smiled. "That just means where it sits, my love." June nodded and continued, her small finger tracing the line that represented the spring. She read the truth of their land, the truth they had fought for, the truth that was now, finally, just paper. She finished and looked up at them, her face beaming. "We are here. We are right here." Rowan smiled. He looked at Eliza, his partner, his wife. The firelight caught the auburn in her hair, the strength in her jaw. He reached out his hand, the one that had signed the partnership, and he rested it gently over his own heart, over the place where the scars lay, one on top of the other. Eliza saw the movement. She saw the peace in his eyes. She reached out her hand, the one that had been stained with ink, the one that had stopped his bleeding in the mud, the one that had signed her name next to his. She placed her hand over his, on his chest. He looked at her, and she at him. The fire was bright. The sky outside was full of stars. Home is where a hand can touch a scar, and it no longer hurts. Thank you so much for listening to this story from Wild West Tales. We would love to know where you are tuning in from in the comments below so we can all connect. So please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and press the hype button to help share this story with more listeners.